Day one of Eagles mandatory minicamp is here, and it wasn't Quinyon Mitchell or Cooper DeJean making headlines. It was former fourth-round pick in Kelee Ringo showing why he shouldn't be forgotten about in the future of cornerback in the Eagles secondary. Talking all that and more on today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everydayers? Welcome on into yet another edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. And I am Gino Camilleri, one of the hosts and the scouting director here at the Locked On Eagles podcast, bringing you 5 episodes each and every week. We are on season 7 here, hosting LOE as a duo, quickly approaching 1,400 episodes together. If you haven't subscribed, liked, commented, interacted with us yet, make sure you do so to keep the pod alive. And on today's show, we're talking about day one of Eagles minicamp. We're talking about some things that Kellen Moore has brought to the table. James Bradberry has returned, potential wide receiver 3, Becton, and Kelee Ringo, the forgotten about Bulldog, and the one guy who might step up at cornerback in a big-time loaded room. But before that, this episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Right now, make every moment more. New customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started today. And to get started, as I had already mentioned, Kelee Ringo. Forget that name? You might. I think a lot of people do in the cornerback discussion. The new fancy toys, Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean. Oh, let's get them out on the track. Let's race these Ferraris around. You bring in Isaiah Rodgers, who comes back off the commissioner's exemption list. Exciting times in the Eagles' defensive secondary. Bring back CGJ. You drafted Sidney Brown last year. You have Reed Blankenship there as well. Darius Slay should be the healthiest he's ever been. James Bradberry, still the elephant in the room. But there's one guy who was a former 4th-round pick who the Eagles used a future 3 to go and acquire. Somebody who had talks about being a day 1, day 2 selection, who ultimately fell to pick 105 for the Philadelphia Eagles. And that was Kelee Ringo. Now let's talk about Kelee. He's 21 years old. June 27th will be his birthday, 7 days after my wife's, so happy early birthday to him and my wife. But Kelee Ringo might be the forgotten about guy in this room, but he wasn't going to let anybody forget who he was when the pads came on, when the Eagles stepped out there for the first practice of Eagles minicamp. All of the Eagles beat reporters were oohing and eyeing over him and his ability to make plays deep down the field, tracking Paris Campbell on a go route and having sticky coverage and phase on A.J. Brown a few times. And that should make you happy if you're a supporter of the Philadelphia Eagles. It should make you happy for the present, that you're going to have depth, that Kelee Ringo in that end-of-the-year performance, which he stepped into being arguably the best cornerback for you, and James Bradberry's place went away, and Darius Slay was injured towards the end of the year, and the slot was more by committee. The only really even-keeled player that was a steady constant for you moving into the playoffs was Kelee Ringo. Now, he had a bad first outing against the Cowboys and play that will probably live on in some Kelee Ringo infamous highlights where he misses a big tackle against the Cowboys. But then he stepped up after that. And that should make all of us happy. And I keep going back to that. Why should we be happy that Kelee Ringo is stepping up? Well, James Bradberry isn't playing corner for this team anymore, which we will talk about. Darius Slay isn't getting any younger. Yeah, Quinyon Mitchell is CB1 moving forward, but beyond that, what's set in stone? Nothing. But if Kelee Ringo, as a future 22-year-old going into this season, can continue to progress, continue to evolve in areas where he might not been as great in college, but has already started to show signs of improvement, i.e. making plays on the ball. His tackling looked a little bit better towards the end of the year. And if you're saying, and a lot of these Eagles beat reporters have been around this team for a while, that he's showing up with guys like Slay and Quinyon and Cooper DeJean and all these guys on the field, and he's the one making plays, folks, you might have your second cornerback outside of Quinyon Mitchell already on this football team. Should make you happy. Because what didn't make me happy? Watching Byron Maxwell, watching Kerry Williams and Bradley Fletcher. Heck, even watching James Bradberry without Darius Slay there last year. What does Kelee Ringo bring to the table? High football pedigree. Played in the SEC. Started to play in big-time games for the Eagles down the stretch. You go look and scout his games, you see week 15, 16, 17, 18, and he's putting on a decent performance. You're going to give him a couple positives. Give him a couple check marks. Now he's another year older, but he's still young. Still 21 years old as we talk. That's young in the NFL. This draft showed you, even in a draft where guys were older, they're still aiming for young football players. He's even younger than Quinyon Mitchell, which is crazy to say. But if Kelee Ringo right away can step in there and potentially challenge first-year Quinyon Mitchell or Isaiah Rodgers or any of the guys, heck, the incumbent in James Bradberry who looks to make a position switch is out the door. There are some young guys that are going to compete against Kelee Ringo. But if he wins the job, that's a positive for everybody involved. You got a home run pick and a fourth-round guy last year, the forgotten Bulldog and Kelee Ringo. You have depth for days at a position where, heck, even last year you didn't have much depth. And that secondary, it's looking good for the future. The youth movement, it's fully on. Heck, outside of Slay and Bradberry, who's the oldest guy in that room? Is it Chauncey, who's still like 27 years old? Kelee Ringo, he's got a bright future in this league. A bright future in this league. A big day one of minicamp for him. Still a long way to go to solidify himself as that number 2, the clear number 2. But we might be talking about him challenging potentially for CB1 talk if he continues this trajectory. Let's speak it into existence. We're the Positivity Pod. It would be great if it goes that way. But having him and Quinyon Mitchell and Isaiah Rodgers and Cooper DeJean and Eli Ricks and Josh Jobe and a lot of these young guys in there to battle, iron sharpens iron. Kelee Ringo knew what the Eagles brought in reinforcements in this draft, and he knew he couldn't sit on his hands. Looks like he's bigger, faster, stronger, and ready to go for 2024. And we're ready to go with Kellen Moore as our offensive coordinator as we shift away from Brian Johnson and we get talking about some of the fun things that Kellen Moore brought to the table on day one of Eagles minicamp, continuing on this edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. This episode of LOE is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. If you're a Philly fan and you see Dallas is in the finals and you want a chance to root against them, well, go and get yourself a ticket to the game over at Game Time. Right now, new customers over at Game Time, you have a chance to get $20 off your purchase of any ticket that you desire, whether it's an NBA Finals game, NHL Finals game, whether you're a soccer fan like myself. I'm going to go see the Colorado Rapids here in Denver this summer. You want to go see a game at a ballpark or a comedy show or a theater event, you're going to go to gametime.co or download the Game Time app and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. With Game Time, you get last-minute deals with the lowest price guarantee or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. You can even see a full panoramic view right from your seat, and the closer to Game Time it gets, the lower the ticket prices get. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome on back, everyone, to this edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. And to our everydayers, are you sick of watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have you turned down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 streaming channel programmed for your everyday to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon TV Fire channels at part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team each and every day. And on this show, we've gone through a lot of offensive coordinators. The Philadelphia Eagles have gone through a lot of offensive coordinators. Jalen Hurts has gone through a lot of offensive coordinators. And Kellen Moore is the newest guy up to the plate. The newest guy to hopefully bring his recipe to the table and hopefully spice Nick Sirianni's up a little bit. Because what happened over the last 2 years, in my opinion, was what we see a lot in football, the idea of groupthink. The idea that you have your set of guys, you think a certain way, it worked once, you're going to keep doing it again. Well, Shane Steichen got things rolling there in Nick Sirianni's first season. He then gets this team to a Super Bowl, and then he gets hired as a head coach. In comes Brian Johnson. Brian Johnson, former quarterbacks coach under Shane Steichen, was in the building with Nick Sirianni and a lot of the people that were foundational pieces to getting this Jalen Hurts type of offense going. Seemed like they kind of sat on their hands a little bit in 2023. They're just hoping Jalen and AJ and Devontae could make up for the lack of motion on offense, the lack of creativity. It felt like if you watched this offense for more than 3 games, you were able to just look at how these guys were lining up and knew exactly what route formations they were going to run. Well, now Kellen Moore is the offensive coordinator. There were multiple beat reporters today from Eagles practice that said one word in particular that got my eyebrows perked up a little bit. And the term was, this offense looks more, quote unquote, spread offense. That might scare you a little bit. Might put a little Chip Kelly narrative into your mind. For me, it excites me. I don't think it's a Chip Kelly type of road to go down. Rather, I think it's the next evolution for what this offense could be, taking the good things of what Nick Sirianni and Brian Johnson did with this offense. And Shane Steichen did a lot of that good stuff that Brian Johnson did, but that's rather here nor there. But taking those quarterback run type of plays that when they hit, they hit. And I know there's not much to this offense that I would really take. The screen game was kind of broken and the running back pass game was broken. But now Kellen Moore, he comes in there. He lined the team up a bunch formations, no pun intended. Some trips looks today. Moves guys all around the formation. That was notable from practice today. And just look at the past numbers from the last few seasons of what Kellen Moore did with the Chargers, what he did with the Cowboys. He has a chessboard and he is willing to move these guys around. A spread style offense, it kind of makes sense now if you look at the moves. The idea of wanting to move away from this big elephants on parade 12 personnel style, which they started to do post 2018, it kind of seems more evident than ever if you look at the moves. We've been saying, when are they going to find a guy to go behind Dallas Goedert as the number 2 at tight end? Well, maybe they don't want to. Maybe they don't want to have these big, heavy 12 personnel, 13 personnel looks. It'll probably be in their bag. It'll be a 60-degree wedge they can throw in there. But at their base, they want to be multiple. And what I mean by that, trips and bunch formations allow you to do a lot of things and disguise a lot within a small area. What does lining up in trips and bunch allow you to do? It allows you to pick apart man offenses, creating natural man rubs at the point of attack, just picking off of the back of one guy. These little out-in routes that just make the cornerbacks and safeties kind of run into each other. Now using more motion, you're going to get the defense's eyes moving different places. You're going to see these plays where there's busted coverage, and you're like, how did Devontae Smith get wide open? Oh, well, because Kellen Moore put in a motion with a guy like Will Shipley or Anais Smith, these young guys that you can move around, Paris Campbell, these guys that you got to kind of manufacture touches to. Maybe that was the road we were headed down all along, and we just weren't paying attention. Now that I'm looking back at it, it kind of makes sense. Is Grant Calcaterra the next guy up? Nick Sirianni believes he can be. I don't think so. Who's going to be the next guy up on offense? Probably going to be Saquon. It's probably going to be Paris Campbell. It's probably going to be Anais Smith. Well, what can you do with all those guys? What can you do with Dallas Goedert as well? I mean, line these guys up in bunch trip formations, move them all around the formation, and make them even more difficult to defend. Create free releases for A.J. Brown to run a simple over pattern across the field where you just put the ball in his hand and you let him run. Create natural man picks where you have an in route from the outside receiver who could potentially be A.J. Brown, and then playing from the slot is Devontae Smith, who all he has to do is get outside of A.J. Brown, who just set that pick, running that in route, and boom, over the shoulder, touchdown. Those are the sort of things that my mind is going to. It's gravitating towards these creative type of offenses where you're seeing guys get open and coverages are busted. And I keep saying that, but that's what they needed, man. Teams were too quick to just go out there and defend the Eagles without having to change things. They set their guys and said, you guys run your plays. We know what they are. We're going to keep things in front of us. Once they took away the explosive element, it was game over for the Eagles. Kellen Moore and his identity, he's going to get that explosive offense back on track. That spread, trips, bunch, things like that, motion. Get somebody who watches the Oregon Ducks, like me. Very excited. But at the same time, you can't go away from the things that have worked. The quarterback power. That option game. That quick RPO game when it works. Got to reinvent a lot of things, but Kellen Moore, hopefully his flavor to this recipe spices things up. And to finish up this episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast, we're going to go around the horn, hit on a bunch of things from camp that we haven't talked about yet. It's the best time of the year when the Eagles got their helmets and pads on. We're talking all that and more here at the Locked On Eagles podcast. We roll along. This episode of LOE is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. The NBA finals are here. The NHL finals are here. Got some big time tournaments coming up this summer in soccer. You always got baseball going on. There's only one place where we make wagers on any of those sports, and it's FanDuel.com/lockedon. And you could go there today to get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. All right, our everydayers, welcome on back. Finishing up this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. I'm your host, Gino Camilleri. We talked about Kelee Ringo, his potential impact at the cornerback position moving forward, what Kellen Moore is looking to do with this offense moving into 2024. And now let's get into some camp notes. Let's go around the board. A lot of things happen in these mandatory mini camps in just a short amount of time. There's only 3 practices before we have a couple weeks off and this team gets into training camp. But every day we get more and more pieces to the puzzle filled out. So one of the big pieces, one of the elephants in the room is cornerback James Bradberry. Well, is he a cornerback? Because today it was reported by multiple Eagles beat writers that the Eagles were going to move James Bradberry to safety and potentially get some reps there. And it sounded good until he went to the training room and he didn't really end up taking any snaps at safety. But taking a step back from what happened on the field today, the move of James Bradberry from corner to safety does a few things for this team. One, it frees up the ability to make sure that these young guys at corner that we had talked about, Kelee Ringo, Cooper DeJean, on and on and on, are able to go out there and get the snaps that they deserve. James Bradberry, frankly, he's not going to play cornerback on this team. What this quote-unquote move to safety shows for me is that he understands where he is in his NFL role right now. Similar to guys like Logan Ryan in the past, Patrick Peterson as of recently, guys who were former corners that made the transition to safety, where you're not having to play in backpedal as much. You could play more downhill. It might play to your strengths where you're not so quick-footed, but if you can be smart, instinctual, and make plays on the ball, James Bradberry might have a role to fill in a very defensive back heavy defense. We talked about how many dime formations this team put out there today at practice. Could he be one of those guys in a sub package role to go in there and be potentially, hopefully not, a slot piece for you that is a matchup based player that only comes in dime situations and strictly big dime situations where that sixth player is a safety? I think it could happen, especially because Sidney Brown still isn't taking full reps in practice. He was off to the side doing some recovery today. Avonte Maddox has also taken reps at safety. Vic Fangio is going to make sure his guys are versatile. He's not going to handcuff any of his guys into one position. And there clearly is a need for depth at safety on this team. If James Bradberry is getting some reps there and Avonte Maddox is getting some reps there. Does this raise his stock on the team? Marginally, I would say. I think it gives him a better opportunity to make this roster than playing cornerback would have. But at the same time, I'd be remiss to go back on what I've said the last couple weeks to Lou, saying I believe they're going to keep the best 12 defensive backs rather than just labeling guys corner or safety. Is JB one of those 12 guys? To be determined. Regardless if it's at safety or corner, I don't think at the end of the day, he is going to be worth keeping him on the roster at that number. You could get out for close to $4.5 million. I think that's what it's going to be at the end of the day. At wide receiver 3, though, they just had some things change up. Devontae Parker retires. Now you have a big hole there. Paris Campbell, Britton Covey, Johnny Wilson. Those are just a few names that stepped up today. And I want to touch specifically on two guys. One in Paris Campbell, and then two in Britton Covey. I just want to touch on Paris Campbell real quick and say, we probably should have seen this coming. It makes a lot of sense, especially with the Kellen Moore hire. Paris Campbell is a guy who you can put in these bunch formations, these trips formations, which they were running a lot of today. Move him around the formation and just get him the ball in space. And at the same time, Nick Sirianni loves his former Indianapolis Colts. How did we not see this coming? That he would take on a more prominent role, i.e. what Zach Pascal did a couple years ago for this team. I would say he's probably the favorite right now to give him a majority of those reps at wide receiver 3. But I also want to talk about Britton Covey. There's no surefire thing on this roster at wide receiver. Even Britton Covey in and of itself is unknown. Oh, he didn't get much playing time there. But does his skill set allow him to play in the slot for this team? I believe it does. I just talked about Paris Campbell being somebody who can get a couple pluses to his skill set, to his arsenal because of Kellen Moore, help bump up his play style, help bump up his athleticism, get him the ball in space. Well, Britton Covey can do a lot of that, but he's a really good route runner as well. And he has very good hands. He's a punt returner. He doesn't muff many of those things. Watch out for Britton Covey. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying he's going to be one of your top 5 guys in target share. No. But could he be a legitimate role player for this team? Yeah, you have to be versatile. You have to be versatile. If he's going to be a returner, he's also got to be able to play some wide receiver for you. And talk about versatile, Mekhi Becton, man. What a signing this was for Howie Roseman. This is a prime Howie signing. Former first-round pick. Height, weight, speed, fits all of them and then some. He's a mammoth of a man. And all of a sudden, you realized he was a tackle. He could play left. He could play right. And now, Jeff Stoutland even said it yesterday, he's seeing that he could play guard for you. Which in practice today, he was playing left guard because Landon Dickerson, who had an excused absence, wasn't there. He was taking first-team reps next to Cam Jurgens, next to Jordan Mailata. And Lou just discussed that they added Max Sharping yesterday. And that's on top of Matt Hennessy. Their interior has a lot of depth. And Mekhi Becton, I think they're going to find a way to get him on the field. Maybe not as a starter, but almost as that 6th offensive lineman that they put in a lot of these packages where they used Cam Jurgens in the past before he was the right guard, where you saw him kind of line up maybe between one of the tackles in Dallas Goedert or just off the line next to one of the tackles and help you out in the run game, help you out in the pass game. Jeff Stoutland just doesn't blow smoke up guys' rear ends just to blow smoke. When he talks, you listen. He gave high praise to Tyler Steen. He's given high praise to Mekhi Becton on his versatility. I think Mekhi is going to have a role to play on this football team, and it's going to get him paid by somebody in 2025. And the one way to get paid in the National Football League is to assure yourself a roster spot, and that is by making special teams if you're one of those fringe guys. But in the returner group today, there were a couple guys that were rookies. You know, Anais Smith, he's going to be in that rotation. Cooper DeJean. But there's one guy who is no way a threat to be cut off of this team. Heck, is probably one of the role players, if not a star on this defense. Chauncey Gardner-Johnson was getting some reps at return today. How juicy is that? Very intriguing. Very intriguing. They're open to just about anything on this Philadelphia Eagles football team. That's what they have to do. Leave no stone unturned. If Chauncey Gardner-Johnson can return punts for you, heck, you found another weapon by signing this guy back. I don't suggest you do that. I suggest you keep him at safety. He's going to be your number 1 defensive back outside of Darius Slay. But besides that, man, you got a good football team. And today's practice showed it. Excited for what day 2 and what day 3 are going to bring. And all of a sudden, we're back into summer camp mode with a couple weeks before training camp. But that'll do it for this edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast and our everydayers. If you didn't know by now, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and it's also available on Amazon Fire TV channels app as well. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today available on the free Fire TV channels app and over at YouTube as well, where you can find us. Subscribe to keep the pod alive. We're bringing you 5 episodes each and every week. We'll be continuing to talk about Eagles mini camp well through the week, all through the summer. We'll be talking about roster battles, a lot of exciting things here at LOE. So make sure you're tuning in each and every day. Make sure you're following us over at Twitter. You can follow myself at GC24_football. Follow my co-host at DiBiase LOE. Follow the main page at Locked On Birds. But until then, make sure you subscribe, listen, make us your first listen, make us your first watch. We love you, everydayers. Signing off, I'm Gino Camilleri. As always, fly Eagles fly.